Hello, sports fans. Yep, it's Maynard Weaver again, back with your 319 Boys Playoff 2011. Welcome back. We got Joe versus Halvey, Haas and Kane, Robbie, the number 2 seed versus Evan, and of course, Timmy's fighting Platypus, number 1 versus Vinny. Let's get straight into it. Joe, the number 5 seed, coming in at 7-4 with his stud Arian Foster versus Halvey, the 4 seed, also at 7-4. Let's break it down for you. Joe, who looks like the better team at this point, despite the lesser seed, scored with the law firm 16. Cedric, where'd he come from? Benson with 20. He had 21 carries, 106 yards, and 1 touchdown. Arian Foster with an average 15.5, or less than average for him. And finally, Greg Jennings with a 15.5. Halvey came into this game scoring well with Cam Newton with a 19 and Marshawn Lynch with a 19.5. Watch out, ladies and gentlemen. Marshawn Lynch in his last 4 games has scored 19.5, 23.5, 15, and another 19.5. Better watch out for Halvey. However, after the first week, the score is 125 to 90.5 in favor of Houdini with a 35-point lead. Passes to the guy, boom goes the dynamite. Looking ahead to week 2, we got Halvey. His interesting matchups are Newton versus Tampa Bay. Marshawn, dare I say, the new Fred effing Savage Lynch versus Philadelphia. And David Akers, the kicker, versus St. Louis. Houdini has the law firm versus Indianapolis, Arian Foster versus Atlanta, Greg Jennings versus New York Giants, and Gronkowski versus Indianapolis. It's going to be a good one. Stay tuned. Alright, our next matchup in this year's playoffs is the number 3, Haas's The Yeti Strikes Back, with a record of 7-3-1 with that tied to Rogers, versus the Kane-Hoos, the number 6 seed with 6-5 record coming into the game. Kane-Hoo, the lesser team of the two, came in scoring well with Matt Ryan with a 22-burger. LaShawn Savage McCoy with an average 14. And then, unfortunately for Kane, he was done in so far this week by his receivers Des Bryant, Andre Johnson, and Nate Washington, scoring 9 points. Yes, that is 1 less than 10 Kane. Auction theory that. Haas came in scoring well with Stafford with a 14. Cruz with a ton of garbage points with a 31.5. No big deal. Percy Harvin with a 20 right in Kane's open gaping mouth. And the Ravens D with a ton of sacks for a 22. At the end of the first week, it was 127.5 to 71.5. A 56-point lead. Kane, you better score 170 this next week. Haas with the top score of the week. Next week, matchups look like Kane has McCoy versus Seattle. Not the best matchup, Kane. Nate Washington versus Buffalo. Could be decent. Des Bryant versus Arizona. Go, Romo, go. And the Pats D versus Indianapolis. Haas comes into it with Cruz versus Green Bay. The Ravens defense playing lowly Cleveland. Matt Forte versus Kansas City. And then Matt Stafford versus New Orleans. Big matchup. Again, Haas versus Kane. Little versus big. Our next matchup in the playoffs was the number 2 seed, Robbie's Matt Timmies, with an 8-3 record. And I might say myself, the best looking nickname out there. Versus the number 7 seed, Evan Nation Army, coming in at 5-6. Let's get right to it. Evan's team scored well with Tony Romo with a 13, LeGarrette Blunt with a 12, and who would have thought Fred Davis with a nice 13. However, Evan was hurt by his team score of Starks, Julio Jones, and Jordy Nelson, scoring only 5 points total. Julio Jones posting a big 0. Hey Evan, maybe over the winter you can sit on that goose egg and rotate, and maybe in the spring it'll produce something for you more than a 0. Just thoughts. Robbie's team, however, scored well with Aaron Rodgers with a 20. Evan's lucky it wasn't a 40-burger. Beanie Wells with a 26. And then he had 228 yards rushing and a touchdown. And Robbie also had Jimmy Graham with a 22.5 stink burger all over Evan's face. Robbie's team pretty much overall all scored well, and he's looking pretty good so far. The score after week 1 is 127-70, a modest 57-point lead for Robbie. Don't worry about it. But next week, looking into it, Evan does have some decent matchups. He's got Romo versus Arizona, LeGarrette Blount versus the hapless Carolina defense, Hakeem Nicks versus Green Bay, and Jordy Nelson versus the Giants. He's going to need some big points. Robbie, looking at it next week, has Aaron Rodgers versus the Giants, Megatron versus New Orleans, Jimmy Graham versus Detroit, and the Bears defense versus Kansas City. We'll see what happens. Alright, and our final playoff game of the week. It is the number 1 Timmy's Fighting Platypus with a record of 9-2 versus Vinny's Sharktopus at 4-7, limping into the playoffs after a loss. However, this was the best matchup of the playoffs by far so far. Vinny came out scoring well with the power of Christ compels ye Tebow with a 14, Chris Johnson with a 17.5, coming on strong lately, and perhaps the Savage of the Year DeMarco Murray with a 14. Braden Marshall had an 18.5, and Roddy White with a 23 against the Vikings' hurting defense. Timmy, not about to take it lightly, scored well with Michael Bush with a 16 filling in for McFadden. Oh, does that hurt, Kane? Does it? No big deal. Bush with a 16, Laurent Savage Pickup Robinson with a 22.5, and then the Ginger Killers, Tom Brady and Wes Welker. Tom Brady with the 28, Wes Welker with the 27. These are the Ginger Killers, together totaling 121 points versus Vincent in the 2 weeks they've played him. In week 1, they had a 34 and a 32, now a 28 and a 27. Finally, though, the score after week 1 is a 124.5 to 116.5. Looks like we have a game for the second week, no thanks to the other 3. Next week's matchups look like Vinny has T-Blows versus Minnesota, Chris Johnson versus Buffalo, DeMarco Murray versus Arizona, Brandon Marshall versus Oakland, and the 49ers defense against St. Louis's offense. Yuck. Timmy next week has Brady and Welker versus Indianapolis, Ray Rice versus Cleveland, Michael Bush versus Miami, Laurent Robinson versus Arizona, and the Jets defense versus Washington. The matchups to watch in this one are going to be Murray versus Laurent Robinson for the Cowboys offense, and Brandon Marshall versus Michael Bush in the Oakland-Miami game. This is easily the closest game to watch with the rivalry and the hatred between the two teams. Game on. To recap, this is Maynard Weber. We have 3 games pretty much decided, with the 4th very much up in the air in the balance. Looks like next week we got some good matchups. However, it looks like it'll be Haas versus Robbie in the semis, and the winner of Vinny and Tim's game versus Joe. And finally, because we're contractually obligated to talk about the other who gives a shit games, Shibe Zombies have a 75 versus TK's Reverse Apache Masters with a 74.5. A couple of our players scored well, a couple of them usually don't. And then the other game, we got Zier's Auto Draftees / Shibe's team with a 94, and then B-Rod's Absentees, scoring well but all on the bench with a 0. Tune in next week when we talk about the next week's matchups.